Welcome back to the Foundation of a Poker Player video series. As you recall, last time I introduced this integrated model of the organization of the brain, neurophysiology, emotion, and cognition, coupled with the adult learning model. And I spoke primarily about neurophysiology, how that pattern recognition software takes information from the sensory system and tells automatic processing what skills to utilize in that moment. Now, how those skills get learned begin at the unconscious incompetency stage. You don't even know what you're not good at. And eventually they get trained at the unconscious competency level, which allows more emotional and mental space for you to take on other stuff. Now, in that unconscious competency stage, well, there are skills that you are quite good at, but there are also skills that we might define as problems, negative patterns that have developed. Well, today we're going to be talking more about the emotional system, how the emotional system actually plays into and perpetuates those problems, as well as how the emotional system plays into learning and how you can use that information to enhance and speed up the process of learning, but also how we can start to understand what those negative patterns are that exist down in neurophysiology, and by doing that we can understand how to begin to change them. So let's take a closer look at exactly what I mean by retraining negative problems or negative patterns. Well, right now, and actually, last time I spoke about those problems being skills, things that you're good at. Well, right now, all of you have sort of naturally responded with ways of trying to manage and contain the problem. Tilt, for example, right? You utilize mental skills, breathing, routine. You end sessions early. There are things that you're doing to keep the consequences of that problem, both mentally, emotionally, and financially, at a minimum. Well, there's a ton of great information out there, and all of you are utilizing much of it to help deal with that problem. Well, this program also says, well, there is a problem or a pattern that is actually feeding and perpetuating that problem. Okay? So, tilt. Well, tilt is going to happen for a reason. And so, tilt actually becomes a symptom of a deeper pattern. For example, take the metaphor of a water main break in a city. Well, the water main break happens for a reason. But what you're seeing is water rushing down the street, right? The water rushing down the street is equivalent to your tilt. This is what you got to deal with at the moment. And if you were to just deal with the problem as it exists or what creates the problem, well, you're still going to have water rushing down the street for quite a while. So those mental skills come in really handy because you got to contain the problem. Like addressing the negative pattern does you really very little good because it takes a little while to get this under control when you're still playing and you got to contain the problem as it exists right now. But over time, as we start to address and deal with these negative patterns, these mental skills and the need for them sort of goes away. And what's left is mental skills that can be utilized to actually enhance your performance. But in order to do that, we got to understand what exists down here. And the emotional system comes in because the emotional system is sort of like the manhole cover. It is our first opportunity to sort of get down into neurophysiology to see what's actually down there. Well, and what's down here, as I said last time, are they potentially some deep-seated, emotional issues, mental issues that, have developed over a longer period of time that may have started in childhood, developed in adulthood, whatever. And that stuff, I encourage you to work on with a professional. I am unable to really address that stuff or help to contain those issues for you in a way that's safe just through a video. So, go to a professional, use your family or your friends as supports. But there are two other things that are contained down here that we are going to address. One is bad habits, things that you've picked up over time that are just annoying, bad patterns. So we're going to take care of those. The other thing is that you've got bad information, information that has actually perpetuated and created those bad habits, that has sort of added layers of complexity to your emotions. They've sort of become like the tilt of tilt, or the anxiety of anxiety, the fear of fear. There are layers upon layers of things that create and perpetuate these problems. And so we're going to begin with giving you some. I'm going to begin by giving you some better information. So as I said, there's a just litany, a preponderance, just an enormous amount of great content out there with regards to mental skills and helping you to manage problems. But what I don't hear about, and what I believe that I'm going to provide to you, is more about the procedure, the process, about how you actually go about taking a piece of content and plugging it in and being able to train it so that you can overcome the issues that you're talking about, as well as to understand exactly how a pattern or problem actually develops. And to do that, I'm going to begin by talking about a research study that I think is going to put into context all of this stuff. And there are a lot of implications that come from it. So it's worth it for us to sort of go through this research. It's ironically called the Iowa Gambling Task. Sort of appropriate, I suppose. Iowa only because that's where the researchers are from. And if you want to look up on the internet, there's a lot of information. This research has been validated over and over again. But to begin, let me just describe exactly what the research, what the task entailed. Basically, participants were given $2,000, and they were told that by drawing from one of 4 piles of cards, that they were to try to make as much money as they could. On each card was a dollar value, either positive or negative. But what they didn't know was that on each of the cards labeled from piles A or B, they could make more money, up and upwards of $100, somewhere in that range. But net picking 10 cards, they were going to lose on average $250 every single time they drew 10 cards from those 2 piles. From piles C and D, they could make up to $50, and over a period of 10 cards, they were going to make $250. And they were told to draw 100 cards. So people were picking cards, right? And over time, they start to naturally pick from piles B and from piles C and D. But at the beginning, they're just sort of randomly picking. Now, what is significant about this research is that after about between 15 to 20 trials, and you can actually see this on this chart here, that their anticipatory SCR level, right, and that's the graph up at the top there, and SCR stands for galvanic skin response, and what that means is it's a measure of physiological reaction, and you actually release a little bit of sweat, and you can see that the response gradually increases and peaks just around 40 trials. What that means is that at that period of time, your body, your mind is reacting as you reach over to pick from pile B or from pile A or B. And what that tells us is that even before you become aware of what the actual pattern is, your body does. And that's called the pre-hunch phase. You have no awareness. You're unconsciously incompetent about what's going on here. Well, eventually between 50 and 80 trials, people actually start to report having some sense of what the pattern is, but they still have no conscious awareness of exactly what it is. It's more of a gut feeling. And then after about 80 trials, they can finally say, and they call this the conceptual phase, they actually can say exactly what's happening. Well, now, if you look at their choices in that graph down below, the number of choices that they take, well, in that hunch phase, they're actually following pretty much the same pattern that they do once they understand it, right? They start taking from more of the good decks, decks C and D, and less from the bad deck. They don't know why they're doing that. They're not even aware that they're doing that, but they're doing it. So what does that tell you? It tells us that the body and the mind pick up on these patterns. This is, to me, the pattern recognition software operating. And, of course, automatic processing, well, it's just moving your arms to pick from which pile. And so, to me, this has a lot of implications as we're moving forward, not the least of which is that once they become aware of this pattern, they are still consciously incompetent. They're still picking from the bad decks. Well, why is that happening? I think there are a number of reasons why that's happening. But truly, if they were truly unconsciously competent about this, they would never pick from the bad deck because they know it's a losing proposition in the long run. Now, the first thing that jumps out to me here is that this is the adult learning model, right? Unconscious incompetence. Your pattern recognition software is gathering data. It's gathering information about what it's sensing and perceiving in the environment, and it's having reactions to what is significant. If it doesn't have a reaction to it, then it's not new. It's not novel. It has a emotional and physiological reaction to what's happening. Now, over time, it gathers enough evidence to say, hey, you know what, conscious mind, you might want to take a look at this. But it would make sense why, one bit of evidence, wouldn't suddenly jump up to the conscious mind. I mean, it would sort of be the equivalent of a guy in the mailroom at some, multinational corporation, knocking on the CEO's door saying, hey, we got a letter complaining about some faulty part. Well, the CEO doesn't care about one time, but you know what? If 1,000 of those letters shows up, he's going to care. So you can see that the body and the brain has this natural protective mechanism that, you know what? One thing is not that big a deal. Well, now if it's, and we're talking more qualitatively here and psychologically, certainly physical danger is a whole other issue, right? But, psychologically, if you're perceiving certain things about the environment, why one thing really wouldn't be relevant? I mean, do we really need to pay attention to that? Well, no, it's not quite that important. But if we've got enough information, well, now you're going to start to get an emotional reaction, and your emotions have access to that information 4 times longer than your conscious mind. But at least at this point, you're starting to do something a little bit more, something a little better. You're actually adapting to the information, but you don't know quite what it is. And at that point, you still don't do it near to the degree that you would want to. It's not trained at the unconscious competency stage. And even when it does become, you do become consciously aware of it, you're still not doing it 100% of the time. It's got to cross the other side, and now you can actually start to use the emotional level to push that information down. And I'll get to that, to more about that later. But I think it's important if we start to move ahead here about, well, how can we use this information to actually speed up the learning process? Okay, we're living in modern society here now, right? And we have the ability to speed up the learning process. As I said last time, the way we do that primarily is through instruction. I mean, that's what makes stocks poker so wonderful. Now, you can imagine if in that research study, the researchers told the participants what the deal was. Well, at any point in that process, the participants would have had a different response based on when the researchers told them what the deal was. Now, if they said at trial, say, 60, right, it's in that still hunch phase. They said, hey, you know what? You pick from piles C and D here, and you're going to make money all the time because A and B, we sort of rigged it for you to lose money. And people are going to go, oh, man, that's it, right? And you can think about your own experience. When you've been given a piece of instruction and you're like, man, that makes so much sense. I got it exactly. Well, why is that? Because you've got enough evidence already stored in your body that proves that that's true. It's not really much of a gap. There's no neurological leap here, and that's actually true. You've got enough evidence stored to say, hey, you know what, this is true, and that guy just pointed out. You saved me about 20 trials. Awesome. Well, what would happen if they said it right away? Are they going to believe them? Maybe they think they're being set up. How do they really know? Okay, so you're going to make a lot more mistakes early on. But when you think about how you evaluate the utility or quality of a given piece of instruction, well, a lot of people, as I've seen, they turn into Rolodexes, right? They've got instruction and they just pull them out. Piece of instruction works, then it doesn't. Next piece of instruction works twice, then it stops working, and maybe it takes 2 or 3 times before you toss that one out. And you're just sort of pulling and grasping from all different areas. So the question is, well, how do you really evaluate the success of a given piece of strategy or instruction that's been given to you? If you're very trusting of the person that's given it to you, well then you're naturally going to accept it. But there's still going to be a neurological gap if that piece of instruction is too big of a jump, because you really haven't been gathering information about it. It's too far outside of your world. I mean, for some of you, what I'm talking about right now may feel that way, and if it seems sort of out there, well, this is kind of why. This is proof that this is too much of a jump for you. Now, that's not to say that it's not valid, but it's going to take a little bit of time and potentially a little bit of repetition hearing this video over and over again until you actually start to get it, because you're going to come back and go, you're going to watch the video, you're going to go back and play for maybe a couple weeks and come back, and now when you come back to this video again, you're going to have a different perspective on it, because just by watching it, you're going to start to gather data subconsciously about whether or not this stuff is actually true. Now, for others of you, this is making total sense. This is like, man, you know what? This actually fits my experience quite well. And now you're going to be able to take another jump ahead and make yourself even more efficient of a learner by utilizing this. Well, now, let's look a little bit about how we actually start to evaluate whether or not a piece of instruction is appropriate, right? So early on, we can think of this sort of as a bell curve, right? You know, bell curve is standard distribution of any information, or we'll say qualitatively, about how you actually go about playing, not results. So at either end of the spectrum, at say +2 or -2 standard distributions from the mean, these are outliers. But at this point, you've got no evidence. Somebody just gave this to you. So what's going to be relevant? Well, they're either going to be positive or negative, and both of them are going to be significant. And they're going to cause a response, just like you saw in the Iowa gambling task. Early on, whether the card was good or bad, people had a response to it. And so at this point, if you are experiencing some doubt about whether or not a piece of instruction is right for you or works, even after using it 5 or 6 times, I would say that doubt is appropriate. You don't have enough evidence. 5 or 6 times is definitely not enough time for your emotional body, your physiology, to accept that this bit of instruction is really going to work. You don't have enough evidence. I mean, the range of complexity in poker is so significant that the number of different ways in which a particular piece of strategy or instruction can fit is numerous. And so you can't assume, just because it worked one time, that it will, in fact, work a second time. And if you do, it's likely that you're going to get nailed by it and potentially get knocked off. And so if it doesn't work, does that mean that it's no longer relevant? Well, of course not. It worked at one point, and it didn't work. Okay, you're gathering evidence as to how in which this bit of instruction actually works. And so, my advice at this point is to not be a Rolodex. Don't have this massive amount of stored instruction that you're just, or strategy that you're just pulling in and out all the time. Find what you know works. And if you don't know what works, then track it. This is another way that you can start to speed up the learning process. Self-reflection. And this is, I'm going to talk more about how the emotional system actually provides guidance through all of this, but you can start to see that if you were to be a little bit more self-reflective and to be strategic about how it is that you are actually going about evaluating strategy and instruction, then you can be a little bit more objective. Because right now, people by and large tend to make subjective decisions, meaning that the decision is based on factors that you don't really know are influencing you, that come from your unconscious stage. So until you gather enough evidence to make a piece of instruction trained at the unconscious competency stage, well, you're going to be influenced and motivated by a lot of factors that are not completely that you're not completely aware of. And so by being active in the process of learning, you can actually start to speed up this process. But, in general, what we're looking to do here is to sort of interweave an old pattern, an old way of doing things, with a new way of doing things. And how that actually happens, I sort of liken to a zipper, right? I mean, a zipper is open, let's say on a pair of jeans. Well, what you're trying to do is to weave the zipper to close up your pants so they don't fall down. But to do that, what does that process actually look like? Well, I'm going to go back to the whiteboard, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so here you've got new instruction. You've got a new piece of information, right? And again, this is coming from your Stocks Poker coaches. poker strategy and instruction is not my forte, but I'm hopeful that I can help you to understand how to close the gap between what it is that you want to be able to do and a system that at this time cannot support or sustain that the integration of that piece of information into your game and be able to execute and do it 100% of the time. There's literally a neurological gap here. That gap is real. For some of you, with a piece of instruction, assuming, let's say, you actually have some evidence for it, and it becomes one of those aha moments, you've got, say, 60 or 70 trials of it, if we're using the example from the Iowa gambling study, this gap is quite small, right? And you can literally, it's like, you jumping over a crack in the sidewalk, right? No big deal. But for some of you, this information is like jumping across the Nile River, the Mississippi River. I mean, it's too big. You got to slowly work your way up to actually building a bridge across it. And well, what that means is merely you just have to gather enough evidence over time. And what that process looks like is literally just you're sort of going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And each time you do this, you're sort of creating a new model. I mean, it's, the system changes a little bit, the instruction changes a little bit. The system changes a little bit, the instruction changes a little bit. And, to what degree depends on, I believe, how active you are in actually doing this. And that's why I say self-reflection is so critical, because if you're going to make the decision and take the intent on of learning something new, and you're going to be strategic about it, such that you perhaps write it down on a piece of paper and track your progress with it, instead of allowing your neurophysiology and emotional system to do all the data gathering. Because when you can sort of consciously direct traffic a little bit here, then you can actually begin to speed up the process of learning. Now, I'm not suggesting that in the middle of a poker session that you're actually taking very detailed notes, but it would be quite easy to have on a sheet of paper, you're working on X, right? And then it shows up and you do it, and let's say positive, negative. Okay? Positive, check, it worked. Negative, it didn't work. Okay, and then after the session, you can come back and evaluate those hands more specifically to see if you can start to understand what it was that the system may have actually picked up that defined whether or not that piece of strategy was going to work or not. Or, more specifically, is there a more refined understanding of that piece of instruction with that specific context, the hand or the information that you got from a particular player? And again, this is stuff that I don't quite know, but hopefully conceptually you're understanding where I'm going here. That you can literally start to speed up the process. And I don't believe in the long run that your neurophysiology has to take, or your conscious mind has to take 8 times as long to figure something out. I mean, that's old hat. This is, to me, a high-performance model of progress. Now, I want to come over here because when we're talking about the cycle of actually improving your poker play and actually even emotionally over a period of time, this model, I think, is highly relevant. Okay, so bell curve, right? At any given point in time, your abilities, and we're going to speak clearly qualitatively here, your poker ability exists along a spectrum. And right now, we're going to say that it's a normal distribution, meaning that 95% of all your poker experience exists between 2 standard deviations of the mean. Okay, 95%. It means anything that exists out here is an outlier. Well, taken from the Iowa gambling study, what is going to become emotionally recognized more easily? Well, stuff in here, it's habituated. This is, you're slightly good, you're slightly bad. You know this deal. I mean, it's not really going to register that significantly at this point. Well, what is? Something real positive or something real negative. It's going to have an emotional charge to it. And so your perception as to what happens here carries some emotional weight. Okay, well, how does that influence your play? Well, people over here can tend to become overconfident, meaning that they think they've actually gotten a lot better than they are, and that this stuff over here has actually gone away, right? And so they believe that they're all good now. Things are fine. Well, what happens? Most often, you get sucked back and remember that all this stuff actually does exist, and you find out when it happens over here. Something negative charges you again, and now you think, well, now you've gone way off the deep end, and especially when you're running bad, this is where you sort of start to operate, and you think that all this stuff went away. Well, that's not really true either. So, in a bigger perspective, I'm going to come back to how all of this stuff sort of applies in the long run, especially in as it relates to how the emotional system operates. But conceptually, I want to get this information out to you first. Well, what actually happens? Okay, now if you experience something completely new, something really positive, I mean, you just expanded your game, whether it be just from new strategy and new poker skill, or whether it be on a more mental, emotional level, that you've actually achieved a level that is greater than you had before. Well, what happens? Everything shifts this way, right? And this now becomes your distribution. It's no longer normal. It's more, not skewed, but it's just stretched out. It's flattened, right? And so if you were to then regress or fall back to this, you can see that the space, I mean, literally the neurological or physical space is actually longer. And so it would make sense on a number of levels why you might think you've fallen off the deep end completely. Why? Well, you had to literally travel farther, and when you got back down here, that space feels really far away, and so you may feel worse, but in actuality you don't feel worse unless you perceive that you've fallen farther, and emotionally you actually feel worse. But in reality, you can never fall farther than this point. Ever. You can never fall farther than what I would call down here is your weakest point. Think of a basketball team, or any team really. You know, that old theory, you're only as strong as your weakest link. Well, here is where your weaknesses lie, and we're talking qualitatively here. Your qualitative weaknesses exist here, okay? And they never really get worse because once you know information, and this is maybe a little bit too out there for some of you, maybe there's too much of a gap for this, but you can't ever unlearn something. It's sort of like The Matrix, right? If you guys have seen that movie where, you know, Neo pops out into the real world, and you can't go back, and if you really could, would you want to? Well, you can't unlearn something. You can hide it, right? You can hide this with any number of things, and you can hide this, you know, and that's where, you know, the emotional clouding comes in, but it never really goes away. Your brain and your body does not operate that way. It just may feel like it. And if it feels like it, then you've sort of added a layer of complexity here. So how can we look at sort of applying these two things conceptually? Well, if you've just gotten better, right, well, then what's going to happen? You're only as strong as your weakest link. Well, until you move this forward, you can only get better going this way. And if you just continue to go this way, and this is still a possibility, well then the significance of when you fall, it's like the higher you go, the harder you fall. Well, that's sort of what happens, and that's why. So if we were to think strategically, and this is how I work with all of my clients, is that we come back and we're like continually identifying weaknesses. When you've fallen, do you want to work on this stuff? When you're on tilt, when you're anxious out of your mind, when you're depressed, do you want to work on this stuff? Not a chance. That's the last thing you want to be doing. Well, when would be the best time to do it? I would think right in here. Okay? Well, this is a time when you gather data about the problem, when you gather data about what your weaknesses are, but this is the time, emotionally, qualitatively, when you're doing quite well, not like super stellar, right? You're not out here continuing to improve. But as soon as you start to back up a little bit, well then that is when you start to take a look at this stuff, right? You've progressed, but you can only progress so much that way. So what happens is, if you were to come back here and work on your weaknesses when you're feeling good, then you can actually push this thing forward, and make the distribution look a little bit more narrow. So your positive hasn't improved any, but we don't really care about that. What you just improved upon is pretty darn good. You don't need to get much better here. What you need to do is shore up your weaknesses. Now you can't really fall as far, right? If you fall that far, well, I mean, that's not really that bad. So you can almost sort of liken this to the way that an inchworm moves, right? Stretches out, comes in, stretches out, comes in. And that process, that cycle, is exactly how people learn. And I hope that you can really, really take the time to let this thing sink in, because I'm telling you, this is powerful. Okay? People do not learn in a linear path, meaning that if we were to look at progress, it does not exist like that. Okay? That is not how it works. People improve on more of a cycle, similar to the way of a stock chart, right? It's up and down, it's up and down. Okay? Now, the direction of your stock chart hopefully means that it's going this way, and certainly quantitatively, I've seen all of you posting these types of charts in terms of your hands played and results. But qualitatively, it's the exact same thing. The old theory of you take 1 step forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That is how people learn. That is not some negative. If you fall back into old patterns, good. It's actually a blessing. Well, why? Because now you've got the perfect opportunity to gather information about your weaknesses, about what trips you up, the triggers, the tendencies that happen, and I'll talk about that later. But the things that happen to you, why you get tripped up, well, you've got direct and salient information at the present time. Up here, if you don't want to think about this stuff, you don't have to. And if you try to, you're not going to know all of it. But once you do fall back into old habits, you can add more anger or frustration on top of it, but that makes it worse. Or you can look at this as a real learning opportunity to identify what your weaknesses are, because you are going to move forward again. You can't go that way, as I said. So you're going to get better. Things are going to look up. And taking some initiative, empowering yourself to see this as opportunity, instantly is going to take a load off and give you direction and strategy in terms of how to make this really useful time. Because to me, there are really no mistakes. I'm sorry, the only mistake you can really make is not learning. No one expects you at any point in time in your poker career to know everything, and even the professionals don't. But what they do better than anybody is that they accept this place, and they know that this place is coming soon. That's it. And they're very comfortable with that. And so, to take this as a real opportunity and to see, look, there's a cycle here. Moving upward and then moving downward, there's benefit here. It's sort of like a stock on the stock market tests a new low. Well, what happens down there? It consolidates things a little bit. Well, when you come back here, you have the opportunity to get rid of things that are no longer relevant. Right? You have new understanding. You've gained new information about how you operate. So you come back here and you say, well, you know what? That doesn't really work quite the same way anymore, and I don't really need to do things that way. I don't want to, tilt because some guy is beating me with rags, or any number of the reasons. And again, I'm not going to go into the specifics now because it's up to you to identify your patterns and tendencies, and I will help you with that in a minute. I just want conceptually to get this. Again, we're talking a cycle here. That's it. People do not progress in a linear fashion. They progress in a more cyclical nature. Now, to me, I think the information that I've just provided is of specific relevance since we're talking about emotion, because information, as I said at the outset, can have a significant effect on your emotional perception of what's happening to you. As I said, if you fall back into old patterns, if you experience tilt, if you have performance anxiety or fear of failure, fear of success, well, layers of emotion get added on top of that because you are consciously aware of it happening. And if you're consciously aware of it happening, then it's potential that you might feel frustrated because it's happening. So you might actually tilt because you're tilting, or you might actually tilt because you feel out of control and have no control of your ability to control yourself. And so you can see how these layers of emotion get sort of compounded, and it's sort of like the I'm rubber and you're glue sort of thing, right? The emotional system bounces something off to the cognitive level, and the cognitive level says, the heck with you, bounces it back down, and all of a sudden you've got another emotion because of what just happened. And so these layers upon layers upon layers get added, and you can see how seemingly benign issues, like for some of you money might be a trigger, feeling like some guy is treating you poorly, or a guy who's or a woman who's disrespectful at the table, how these seemingly innocuous, just benign issues can turn into these much bigger things. And remember that the initial pattern has developed for reasons that you may not really be aware of. And so, on the one hand, you can begin to get awareness of what those deeper reasons are, how the pattern actually began to develop. But we can also start to just unravel the emotional layers just by having better information. And so if we are going to start to take a better look at understanding some of the reasons, because that is relevant, these bad habits that you have developed over time, and you can change those negative patterns. But what we need to understand is that all emotion is actually your best guidance system to understanding what exists at neurophysiology. You can think of your emotions as your GPS system. It helps you to understand and recognize what's down there, because your reactions are a pure reflection of what exists there. Now, on the one hand, they may seem totally irrational and totally disproportionate to the situation, and that is quite accurate. But that doesn't change the fact that they are a pure reflection of the way that your system, the way that you operate at this point in time. And so if you were to continue to buffer them using defense mechanisms, and I'll get to that more in the third video, using defense mechanisms such as denial, projection, meaning that you blame things on other people, and a litany of other ways that we sort of defend ourselves against emotion that's uncomfortable. If you continue to do that, then in essence, if we're looking at that Iowa gambling study, you're preventing and holding that information that the emotional level is containing. You're keeping it down. You're keeping it at bay, and that emotion will start to accumulate. And so when you do experience tilt or performance anxiety, there is no doubt that those things exist, or any pattern that contains significant emotion. There's no doubt that exists because emotion has been accumulating. And we know that there's actually a negative pattern that exists that tells your emotional system to gather emotion, because you've become unconsciously competent about gathering and containing emotion. We don't want that to happen. And so there are several ways that you can release emotion. You tilt, you go freaking monkey ape crazy, and then eventually things calm down, you go for a walk, you cool off, but eventually that whole pattern is going to happen again. You just sort of dumped out a bucket of water, but you stuck it back under the faucet. The thing's going to fill up. How significant the pattern is, how badly you're running, there are a number of factors that affect how quickly that bucket is going to fill back up, but it's going to fill back up unless you change the pattern itself that is designed to accumulate that emotion. As some of you have probably already realized here, I'm 40 plus minutes into this video and we haven't even cracked talking about the emotional system exactly, and how emotion really plays into some of these issues. And certainly I've given you the information that you need in order to remove a lot of the emotion that gets laid on top of the issues at hand, but that doesn't really quite address the issue specifically, and there's more information that you need to know about the emotional system, as well as to provide you some strategies to begin addressing it. So I'm going to stop this video here, and we're going to go on to part 2, which is going to address specifically emotion and memory, emotion as it relates to performance, and specifically the zone, what exactly the zone is, and how you can start to begin to conceptualize how to actually move in that direction. I'll talk about how emotion can actually be a distraction and nothing more. We'll talk about the difference between confidence and competence and which is actually more important. And then we're going to spend a majority of the time actually looking at some strategies to begin addressing issues that exist here. Because as I've talked to you about, we need to get a sense of your patterns, and the information that I provided up to this point is all relevant information for you to know exactly what to be looking for and how to be looking for it. But I'm going to provide you with a little bit more of clear guidance as to how to organize that information, and specifically how you can begin to start adding in some relevant mental skills to begin to help mediate and contain the emotion that produces some of the problems that you're seeing.